as I've always enjoyed driving at night. The empty roads, the cool breeze through the open window, and the quiet solitude felt very calming. That night, however, was anything but calming. I was on my way back from a late-night shift, the clock edging past midnight. The highway was mostly deserted, just me and the occasional passing truck. As I drove, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend Amy. "Hey, be careful. There's a story on the news about a missing girl from our town, last seen hitchhiking near Route 23. I replied quickly, "Thanks for the heads up. I'm on Route 23 now, heading home." I put my phone back in the cup holder and focused on the road. The night was unusually dark, with thick clouds obscuring the moon. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A girl standing by the roadside with her thumb out. My mind immediately went to Amy's text. I slowed down, considering what to do. Should I stop? Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The girl approached the passenger side window. She looked to be in her early 20s, soaking wet as if she'd been caught in a storm. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky. "My car broke down a few miles back. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" I hesitated. Something about her seemed off, but I couldn't just leave her there. "Sure," I said, unlocking the door. "Get in." As she climbed in, I noticed her clothes were torn and dirty, and she had a haunted look in her eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked as I started driving again. She nodded slowly. "I just need to get home." We drove in silence for a few minutes. I tried to engage her in small talk, but she was mostly unresponsive. Just when I thought she might fall asleep, she turned to me and said, "Have you ever heard of the Midnight Caller?" The question took me by surprise. "No, I haven't. What's that?" She shifted in her seat, looking out the window. "It's an old urban legend around here. They say if you're driving alone at night and you see a girl by the road, you shouldn't stop. Some people think it's a setup for a robbery or worse." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you saying you're part of that?" She shook her head. "No, but I've been scared of it happening to me." The fear in her voice was palpable. I didn't know whether to believe her or not, but the story was starting to get under my skin. We continued driving, the road stretching endlessly before us. The minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. It was another text from Amy. "Police just found the missing girl's body near Route 23. Be careful." My heart pounded in my chest. I glanced at the girl beside me, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. Was she the missing girl or something else? "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me with a sad smile. "Just someone trying to get home." Before I could respond, the headlights of an oncoming truck blinded me. I swerved to avoid it, and in the chaos, I lost control of the car. We skidded off the road, crashing into a ditch. When I came to, the girl was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door hanging open. I stumbled out of the car, searching the area, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I called the police and they arrived quickly. They took my statement and searched the area, but they found nothing. No footprints, no evidence of another person. As they towed my car away, one of the officers pulled me aside. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "There have been reports of people using hitchhiking as a way to lure drivers into traps. Most people don't make it out." I drove home in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something beyond explanation, something dark and terrifying. To this day, I still drive at night, but every time I pass by Route 23, I remember the girl and the urban legend of the Midnight Caller. I don't know what I encountered that night, but one thing is certain, I'll never forget it. So if you're ever driving alone at night and you see a girl by the roadside, think twice before stopping. Some situations are more dangerous than we'd like to believe. And as for me, I'll always wonder, did I escape a trap? Or did I leave a girl in desperate need behind? Either way, the Midnight Caller remains a haunting memory of a night I'll never forget. It's funny how a late-night drive can feel like you're floating through a different world. The darkness envelops you, the road stretches infinitely ahead, and the headlights carve out a small sanctuary of light in the vast night. My name is Alex, and I've always found driving at night to be oddly comforting. But one night, a few months ago, that comfort turned into a chilling experience I won't soon forget. I was driving back from a late shift at the hospital. The clock on my dashboard blinked 1:47 a.m. I yawned, feeling the fatigue settle in my bones. My route took me through a desolate stretch of highway, flanked by dense woods on either side. There were no streetlights, just the moon hanging low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a woman, drenched from the rain that had just stopped. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, and her hair hung in wet strands around her face. She held out her thumb in a classic hitchhiker's gesture. Now, I know what you're thinking. Picking up a hitchhiker in the dead of night. Not the smartest move, but something about her seemed desperate, and I couldn't just leave her out there. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Hey, do you need a ride?" I called out. She nodded vigorously, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Yes, please. Thank you so much." I unlocked the passenger door and she climbed in, shivering. As she settled into the seat, I noticed her hands were shaking. I turned up the heat and handed her a spare blanket I kept in the back seat for emergencies. "What's your name?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road. "Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. We drove in silence for a few minutes. I glanced at her occasionally, noting how she stared out the window, her eyes darting nervously. I decided to break the silence. "So, what were you doing out there in the middle of the night?" She hesitated before answering. "My car broke down a few miles back. I didn't have any cell service, so I started walking, hoping to find help." "You're lucky I came along," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "This stretch of road is pretty deserted at night." She nodded but didn't say anything more. I decided not to press her. We continued driving, the silence between us growing heavier. As we passed mile marker 237, she suddenly tensed up, her breathing quickening. "What's wrong?" I asked, concerned. "Can you speed up, please?" she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Why? What's going on?" "Just, please," she insisted, looking over her shoulder at the road behind us. I complied, pressing the gas pedal a little harder. My heart began to race as well, an inexplicable fear creeping into my mind. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing us, but there was nothing. After a few more tense minutes, she finally relaxed a bit. "Thank you," she whispered. We drove for a while longer, and I saw an exit for a small town coming up. "Do you want me to drop you off at a motel or something?" I asked. "Yes, please. That would be perfect." I took the exit and pulled into the parking lot of the first motel we found. I parked the car and she turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough," she said. "You probably saved my life tonight." I gave her a small smile. "I'm just glad I could help. Take care of yourself, okay?" She nodded and got out of the car. I watched as she walked into the motel lobby. Then I pulled back onto the road, eager to get home and forget this strange night. A few days later, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease from that night. On a whim, I decided to look up any recent news from the area where I had picked Sarah up. What I found sent chills down my spine. There was a report about a car accident on that very stretch of highway. A young woman named Sarah had died in a crash after her car skidded off the road during the storm. The accident had occurred around the same time I picked up my hitchhiker. I sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief. Could it have been the same Sarah? The one I picked up? No, it had to be some kind of mistake or coincidence. But deep down, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that I had somehow been a part of something beyond explanation. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Was it just a strange coincidence? All I know is that ever since that night, I can't drive that stretch of highway without feeling a cold chill run down my spine. And sometimes, just sometimes, I glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a hitchhiker standing by the side of the road, waiting for a ride that never came. Thank you for listening to my story. Drive safe out there, especially at night. You never know what might be waiting for you on the side of the road. There's something both soothing and unnerving about a night drive. The hum of the engine, the darkness enveloping the road, and the occasional flash of headlights passing by. It's a time for contemplation, but sometimes the mind wanders to places it shouldn't. The clock on the dashboard glowed 11:37 p.m. as John guided his car through the winding rural roads of upstate New York. He was returning home from a business trip, eager to get back to his family. The GPS indicated he had about an hour left before reaching his suburban neighborhood. He yawned, the fatigue from a long day beginning to take its toll. John was a cautious driver, especially at night. He kept his speed just below the limit, eyes scanning the road for any sudden movements. Deer were common in this area, and the last thing he needed was an accident. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. A woman, drenched from the rain, frantically waving her arms. John's instincts told him to drive past, but the moral dilemma gnawed at him. He slowed down and pulled over, helping someone in distress at night on a deserted road. It's the right thing to do, isn't it? But John couldn't shake the unease settling in his stomach. John rolled down the window slightly. "Are you all right?" he called out. The woman, her face pale and eyes wide with fear, approached the car. "My car broke down," she said, her voice trembling. "Can you help me? Please?" John hesitated but then nodded. "All right, get in. We'll call for help once we're in range." Emily climbed into the passenger seat, shivering. John turned up the heat and offered her a blanket from the back seat. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping herself tightly. As they drove, John tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily," she replied, staring out the window. "Where are you headed, Emily?" "Just trying to get home," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's been a rough night." A rough night. John could sense there was more to her story, but he didn't press. Sometimes people just need a little kindness without questions. They drove in silence for a few miles, the only sound the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. John's heart sank. "Not now," he muttered, steering the car to the side of the road as it coasted to a stop. A car breaking down in the middle of nowhere at night. It's the stuff of nightmares, isn't it? But this was no nightmare. This was real. John tried the ignition again, but it was no use. The engine was dead. He glanced at his phone, but there was no signal. "Great," he sighed, glancing at Emily. "Looks like we're stuck." Emily's expression was unreadable, a mix of fear and something else John couldn't quite place. "We should wait," she said. "Someone will come along." Waiting in a broken-down car on a deserted road with a stranger. What could go wrong? John was about to find out. Minutes turned into an hour. The rain continued to pour and the night grew colder. Suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. John and Emily both watched as the vehicle approached. It was a large, black SUV. The driver pulled over and rolled down the window. "You folks need some help?" A deep voice called out. Help at last. But sometimes help isn't what it seems. John explained their situation and the man offered to give them a ride to the nearest town. "It's not far," he assured them. "Just hop in." Emily hesitated, but John nodded. "Thank you," he said, helping Emily out of the car and into the SUV. The driver was a burly man with a stern expression. As they drove, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, and his grip on the steering wheel seemed overly tight. Trusting a stranger in the middle of the night. Sometimes you have no other choice, but that doesn't mean it's safe. After a few miles, the man spoke. "What brings you two out here?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Our car broke down," John repeated. "We were just trying to get home." The man nodded, but there was something in his gaze that made John uneasy. He glanced at Emily, who was staring straight ahead, her face pale. Suddenly, the SUV veered off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path. John's heart raced. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Shortcut," the man replied curtly. "Sometimes shortcuts lead you to places you never wanted to go." John's grip tightened on the door handle as the SUV bounced along the rough path. He exchanged a worried glance with Emily, who now looked terrified. The path opened into a clearing and the man stopped the SUV. "End of the line," he said, turning to face them with a grim expression. John's mind raced. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "You shouldn't have picked her up," the man said, nodding towards Emily. "People around here know better." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The man sighed. "You folks stay here. I'll radio for some help. It's safer this way." John's heart was pounding, but he nodded, relieved to hear the man wasn't abandoning them. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. The man walked a few paces away, pulling out his cell phone. He spoke quietly into it, his words indistinct in the rain. John and Emily huddled together, the cold seeping into their bones. Minutes later, the man returned. "A tow truck is on its way," he said. "Should be here in about 30 minutes. In the meantime, you two can wait in my car to stay warm." John nodded, grateful for the gesture. "Thank you," he repeated. "Really, thank you." As they settled back into the SUV, John noticed the man kept a close watch on the surroundings. "I'm a local," he said, noticing John's glance. "Know these roads well. Just didn't want you getting caught up in something bad." Emily, still shivering, murmured, "What do you mean by something bad?" The man sighed deeply. "This area isn't always safe at night. There's been trouble with people breaking down and running into the wrong folks. You're lucky I came by." The rain continued to pour, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, the tow truck arrived, its lights cutting through the darkness. The driver, a burly man with a kind face, hooked up John's car and offered them a ride to the nearest service station. John thanked the man once more as they parted ways. The SUV drove off into the night, its taillights disappearing into the rain. The tow truck driver was friendly, chatting lightly as they made their way to the station. He reassured John that his car could be fixed by morning. As they pulled into the service station, John felt a wave of relief wash over him. Emily seemed more relaxed too, though she still looked a bit shaken. As they waited in the small, brightly lit waiting room, John and Emily exchanged a look of shared relief and gratitude. They had made it through the night thanks to the help of a stranger who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Remember, the next time you're on a night drive, keep your eyes on the road and your mind sharp. You never know what or who you might encounter out there in the dark.